As we conclude our study of 1st and 2nd Kings, let's turn our attention to various theological observations. I found it helpful to notice what Walter Brueggemann says in his introduction to the Old Testament concerning the style or outlook that we encounter when we read Kings. He calls it a theological commentary. Thus, 1st and 2nd Kings offers a theological and interpretive commentary upon the history that can be otherwise known. What he's saying is there were available to the people of that day other resources by which they could understand what had gone on in the past decades or past centuries of their nation. But the contribution of the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings was to take that known and otherwise available history and add to it a level of illumination, a theological and an interpretive commentary on that history. As we take a look at other histories from the ancient world, we find that the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, and similarly the style that we find in Samuel, it contrasts this sort of tone that we find in royal histories. In the case of royal histories, there tends to be a high degree of favoritism, of beneficial portrayal of the king whose history is being written. Note how different that is from the portrayal of the various kings that we find in these biblical books. The writers are completely open to declaring whether a king did the country well or whether the king did the country harm, and that assessment is based on a theological interpretation. Let's consider how God is portrayed and the kind of involvement that we see from God in these books. This is not meant to be comprehensive, but just a representative sampling. So we find, for example, that God is communicating with Solomon through a dream early on in 1st Kings. We find at various instances God is holding kings accountable specifically by sending messages to them through the prophets, to Baasha, to Jeroboam, to Ahab by various prophets. Kings are not the only ones whom God holds accountable. However, the prophets themselves are accountable to God. And we find that arresting story in 1 Kings 13, where a nameless prophet initially obeyed, but then disobeyed by accepting hospitality from someone in northern Israel when God's direction to him was deliver your message and then clear out without accepting any hospitality. He obeyed half of the assignment, but he was tricked into disobeying the second half and lost his life as a result of it. So we find God holding prophets accountable. We find God vindicating the honor of various individuals. Even Ahab, whose conduct was so reprehensible, in 1 Kings 20 we find that God comes to his aid, delivering him, giving him victory against the Syrians, against Aram, even despite the fact that Ahab is not an ethically upright character. How about human involvement? Again, not comprehensive, but just a snapshot to help us look through this angle, this lens, theologically for these books. We find that there are some monarchs whose human involvement, together with some prophets, really constitutes cooperating with God. Think of Solomon at the front end of his monarchy. He is very much intent on walking according to God's highest principles. We find the courage of Elijah walking with God. Micaiah, that witty, salty prophet. The king Asa of the southern kingdom demonstrates a heart inclined to choose God's values. And so with his son Jehoshaphat, with Hezekiah, and with King Josiah, all those in the south. Monarchs and prophets who determined to cooperate with God. There were unfortunately some individuals whose record is that of opposing God, and now we're thinking of Solomon towards the latter part of his reign. Jeroboam the first in the north, in particular Ahab in the north, Manasseh in the south, at whose feet is laid the fault for the eventual demise of the southern kingdom. In the case of King Rehoboam, son of Solomon, we might be inclined to put him among those who opposed God. Certainly, he reaped some negative results in consequence of his choices. But perhaps a more singular assessment would be to describe him as unwise. Unwise. Instead of taking the seasoned counsel of his senior advisors and lightening the tax load on his people, he takes the advice instead of his younger peer advisors and makes things worse for the population. They rebel, particularly those from the north following Jeroboam, and the kingdom is split under the rule of Rehoboam. I'd like to direct our attention to a passage from 1 Kings 9, where God makes it very clear that no amount of past obedience will make up for future faithfulness to God. In 1 Kings 9, we're located at the point in their history where the temple under Solomon has been built and dedicated gloriously. Solomon has then completed building his own palace. And now in chapter 9, God says this to Solomon: "My eyes and my heart will always be there," and he's referring to the temple. "As for you, if you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command, and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, 'You shall never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel.' But if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off and serve other gods, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples." This warning comes to Israel before the southern kingdom has fallen, even before the northern kingdom has fallen. This is God's word to Solomon. And in it we find the seeds that explain why it was that northern Israel could not hang on to its land and southern Israel was eventually evicted from the land promised to them. In short, the dynasty, the privilege of living in God's land, was conditional. The same expectations, just as God had expectations for the behavior of those who preceded Israel in Palestine, and when their sin reached a point that God could tolerate it no longer, he ushered them out and ushered Israel in. They were thinking of the conquest under Joshua. Israel, by similar token, will be accountable for their behavior to God. If they refuse to walk in the covenant, in the directives that God has given them, which are for their life, then they will forfeit the privilege of remaining in that land, even though they have been especially chosen as God's agent to be his people and eventually to bring the message in the person of the Messiah. As we come towards the close of this video, it will be important that we register the clarity of the message given in 2 Kings 17. Here we find God's assessment of why it was that the northern kingdom was overthrown by Assyria and sent off, scattered into exile. We've looked at this earlier in the video series, but it's very important that we not miss this and touch it once again towards the close. Verse 7, very plainly the writer indicates that the people of Israel sinned, and it was worship of other gods that constituted that sin. They displaced God and put their spiritual allegiance somewhere else. You notice the depth to which that penetrated. They were doing things secretly which offended God. And then out in the open, they were making high places. This constituted wicked activity, and the result would be fairly predictable. It engendered anger in the God who loved them. that did not keep God from sending warning to Israel. And notice that Judah is listed already as well. Every prophet, every seer, please notice the sense of a ongoing, time after time, year after year, God would send these messengers. This is where the mercy grows larger and larger. The continual flow of warning messages. And in spite of that, they said, we're not interested in turning from evil ways. We're not interested in beginning again to keep God's commandments and statutes. Because, verse 14, they were stubborn. The statutes in the covenant that were designed to draw them close to God and keep them in a vital, a vibrant, a rich and living quality of life, this they despised. Again, verse 15, false idols. Not only did they go after them, but as a result, they became hollow, artificial themselves. The picture of dissatisfaction would infuse itself in that language as well, would it not? And instead of being a people uniquely allied to God, they thought it was more fashionable to imitate people around them who knew nothing of God, to the extent that they even took the treasure of human life, children who were entrusted to them for protection and care, and made them pass through the fire, child sacrifice. This registers so high on things that God did not want his people to do, or any people to do, things that are heinous, things that anger God out of his desire to protect the young. And therefore we see God was not just angry, but God was very angry with Israel, to the extent that he removed them out of his sight, that separation from his presence. As you know the ongoing history of Israel, you know that God wasn't finished with that people. A prominent message that you'll find in the book of Ezekiel is God reassuring them that even though he has kicked them out of the land, he is traveling with them. And so we find, as centuries progressed, Israel is back in the land, and finally that will be the place that the Messiah is born, an indication that God keeps his covenant, even though, at times, his people turn their back on him and suffer the consequences. There are various ways that we could draw out application from the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Here are some thoughts that may be worth our considering. First, for the original audience. Since at the close of the book, we find that Israel is in exile, well, yes, there are a few people who are left in Israel proper in Palestine, but by and large, people have been deported to Babylon. They're in exile as they learn this story. Israel must learn from their own past mistakes. This would be the way that the audience of the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings could apply these principles. Learn from those mistakes and then live differently in the future, instead choosing to honor God by taking his directives, his statutes, his laws, and saying, yes, we will make these part of our life, and we will change our lifestyle in order to match how God has said we should live. What about leaders? Since, after all, the book of 1st and 2nd Kings are predominantly about people in leadership, we learn from these accounts that leaders must not only begin well, but they must carry out the course of their life and finish well. Think, for example, of Solomon and his failure to do that. Finishing well means honoring God. And we've seen that not only are monarchs held accountable, but spiritual leaders, such as prophets, are held accountable for this as well. This, too, is a message to us. Many of the original applications, as usual, will have bearing for us today, but consider these two particularly. Whatever may be the extent of our individual authority, we may not be kings or queens, we may not be senators or presidents or prime ministers, nevertheless, all of us have been entrusted with authority over some situations and some persons in life. Whatever then may be that extent of our authority, we as well need to cling to the fact that as leaders, we are accountable to God. This is so important to keep in mind. And we must, individually and collectively, determine to embrace God's directions, not stubbornly resist them. Since, after all, God's directions, God's laws and statutes are designed to bring us into a life that is rich and rewarding.